All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful and feared figures of the 20th century, a man whose name is tied to revolution, to terror, and to the rise of a global superpower, Joseph Stalin. He literally forged a new nation, but the price for that was, well, it's a price we're still grappling with today.
So, when you peel back all the layers of propaganda and history, who was this guy really? Was he the revolutionary hero who built the Soviet Union into a force to be reckoned with? Or was he a brutal dictator responsible for unbelievable suffering? That's the question we're going to dive into. Let's get started.
You know, his story doesn't start in some grand political hall. It starts in a place you would never expect for a future dictator, a seminary. Yeah, this is the story of how a young man, once on the path to become a priest, ended up the supreme leader of a vast empire.
First off, he wasn't born Stalin. His name was Josef Vissarionovich Jugashvili. He chose the name Stalin later, and it comes from the Russian word for steel. And that wasn't just a cool nickname, it was a brand. He was crafting an image of himself as the unbreakable man of steel.
So let's look at how he climbed the ladder. He was born poor, was supposed to be a priest, but got swept up in the revolutionary fever of the time. He was right there with Lenin during the Russian Revolution, but the real game began after Lenin died. Stalin was patient, and he was absolutely ruthless. He'd team up with rivals to take down one guy, like the famous intellectual Trotsky, and then, once that was done, he'd turn on the very people who just helped him. One by one, he outmaneuvered everyone until he was the only one left at the top.
So now he's in charge, and he has this epic mission to drag the Soviet Union kicking and screaming into the modern world and make it a superpower. But the way he did it, well, the cost was just terrifying. His number one goal was industrialization, and he wanted it done fast. He was going to transform this massive agricultural country into an industrial powerhouse that could go toe-to-toe with the West. And honestly, if you just look at the raw numbers, the steel production, the factories, he did it.
But that success came with a horrifying reality check. To pay for all those factories, Stalin took control of the farms. It was called forced collectivization. Imagine being a farmer your whole life, and then one day the state shows up and takes your land, your tools, your animals, everything. This policy completely shattered the country's food supply, and it led directly to man-made famines that killed millions of people. For the state to progress, the people had to starve.
And at the same time he was building factories, he was building something else, the perfect police state. This period was all about absolute control, driven by a paranoia that created a cloud of fear over every part of Soviet life.
One of the main engines of this terror was the Gulag. And we need to be clear, this wasn't just a prison system. This was a gigantic network of brutal, forced labor camps, a lot of them in the middle of frozen Siberia. Millions were sent there. An incredible number of them never came back.
Then came what's known as the Great Purge. And during this period, absolutely no one was safe. It wasn't just political enemies. Stalin went after his top military generals, famous writers, scientists, and just regular people. All you had to do was be labeled an enemy of the state, maybe for telling a bad joke or knowing the wrong person, and you could just disappear. He even staged these elaborate public show trials where old revolutionaries were forced to confess to these wild crimes before being executed. It was all about creating total control through total fear.
But just when you think you have him figured out, the story takes another turn. The final chapter of his life is what makes his legacy so incredibly complicated and so fiercely debated even today.
In 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and suddenly, Stalin, this brutal dictator, became a crucial world leader. The Soviets suffered unbelievable losses at first, but he managed to rally the country. The sacrifice made by the Soviet people was almost unimaginable, but their role in defeating Nazi Germany was absolutely, without a doubt, decisive.
And that right there, that's the central paradox of Joseph Stalin. How do you reconcile these two sides? On one hand, you have the nation builder, the guy who industrialized a country and led the fight against Hitler. On the other hand, you have the paranoid tyrant who created a system of terror that killed millions of his own citizens. They're not two different people. They're both Stalin. So we're left with this really tough question. He was the architect of a superpower and the architect of a graveyard. Understanding Stalin isn't about picking which story you like better. It's about facing the deeply unsettling truth that both of these things can be true of the same person. So how should history remember him? That's one of the biggest, most difficult questions the 20th century left us with.